Historically, the world has been affected by many infectious diseases on a global stage. But the effect of COVID-19 on our community is one that will be etched in our minds forever. I remember waiting along with the rest of the world, waiting for doctors and world leaders to decide on what the best option would be, and them telling us that quarantining and locking down the world is the only way that they would agree for us to save lives. This quarantine and lockdown had positive and negative effects. If you look at it, glass half full or glass half empty, or even like a coin that has two sides, heads and tails, these positive and negative impacts had unintended consequences on us as a community. Positively, many lives were saved, bonds and memories were created with families. On a negative side of it, I can remember countries shutting down their borders to foreign people coming in. I remember the stock market crashing, employees being fired, hospitals canceling elective surgeries, and most importantly, to us as a community, our religious centers being shut down. But there was a silver lining. Schools, workplaces, and religious centers used and leveraged technology to move our programs, classes, and meetings online. This now leads us to a granular question. Did moving our majalises and moving all of these programs online create unintended consequences? My name is Mikhail Dharsi, and I am your host for this very first episode of Candid Talk at HIC. I'm here sitting with Sheikh Abbas, all the way from London. Sheikh Abbas, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you for taking the time and sitting here with us on our very first episode. I wanted to get your input and lead you to our question, which were the unintended consequences that moving our programs online had brought onto us that we didn't see coming. When the coronavirus had hit the world on a global stage, it was in a very important time within our religious calendar. It was during the month of Shaban, which in itself had many programs, and especially before probably the busiest month for our communities, which is the month of Ramadan. Stopping programs, eating iftar with friends, attending majlises, spending time with friends with sports and eating together, breaking our fast together were things that had to be shut down and stopped and was immediately sent where we had to stay at home.
Yes.
How did this affect you on a personal level?
Well, as you rightly say, it happened at a time when there's lots of programs already planned, and then the month of Ramadan was around the corner. When I cast my mind back to it, 2 or 3 things stand out. Initially, there was a sense of disbelief. It seemed surreal. We were hearing of a virus coming out of China, and it seemed like a problem for another part of the world. And a lot of people thought that there was a fuss about nothing. As time wore on, it became clear that no, this was a problem that had come into our country. People were falling sick. And the government now began to advise isolation and shutting down every public meeting place. So when that acceptance gradually came in, even then, I remember distinctly everybody thinking it's a temporary thing. You know, sometimes on your sat-nav, when you take a wrong turn, it keeps wanting you to go back to that old way because it says, no, you've gone on, come back, another half a mile, come back. Everybody thought we can restore normal programming in a matter of just weeks. However, COVID, as you know, stayed with us for a long time, and this gradual acceptance of it meant that we had to come up with new strategies. One of them, as you rightly mentioned, leveraging the online platforms. We had some experience with it because most of our programs were relayed online, but the idea that the whole community listens to it online was new both for the organizers as well as for the community itself. So everybody got very conversant with Zoom and other similar platforms. and they started to listen to programs and participate in du'as, even darsa and lectures from home, having iftar in their own, with their own home, people who are living with them and so on, and waiting eagerly for the time when all this will pass.
Yeah.
So that was the initial reaction. As for us speakers, I was meant to go abroad to lecture, 2 or 3 different places, and all those gradually, those centers shut down, and the programs were transferred to online broadcasts.
Now, moving everything online, coming back to our original question, was the positive and negative impacts that it could have had on a community level. Positively, some examples would be the opportunity to listen to programs all around the world because it was now more available. Well, people were put into a situation where it became more available for them.
Yes.
Do you feel like these positive impacts are something that should continue, or something that people should look into, and something that we should go on with the way times are going?
My own sense was that initially people were uncomfortable with the format. They felt that this was second best. Listening to a majlis on your own and finding that sort of inspiration to sit properly, formally, and listen and all that was difficult because you were trying to do it just for your own home. However, what was interesting is that, like everything else, after a while, when this thing began to bite deep and we realized that we were in it for the long haul, and Muharram came and so on, it became something more normal. And people then began, as human beings always do, to try to see the silver linings in these things. So, if we look at a typical majlis that is held in the center, you come to the center, you have to leave your home, you come into the center, but you meet with people, you sit together in devotion, you sit together to listen to a majlis, you break fast together, there's a social element, there is, we worship communally and so on. Compare and contrast that to what happens at home. Yep, you're right, you can listen to many more channels. You can channel hop, you can speed up the majlis, you can cut out bits of the majlis, forward it. You can listen at your own leisure. So for example, if majlis is at 8 o'clock, doesn't mean you have to listen to it at 8 o'clock. You can listen to it at 10 o'clock and so on. So there were those things. You could listen to it with a cup of tea in your hand. You could pause it and discuss a concept or a point with your family. So people started to get used to that format. And then there was this question that, hey, this works. This is even more efficient because, for example, in Stanmore, to go to the mosque, listen to the lecture, come back, that's a 3-hour exercise. To just purely listen to darsa, dua, and majlis is possibly an hour, maybe a little bit more than that. So this whole question came about us being more efficient. We can use the other 2 hours to maybe listen to more lectures. And so this whole debate began. That when and if the time ever comes that we are free from this pandemic, will our mosque experience need to be the same? Is there room for a more hybrid kind of program where there is both online programming sometimes and in-person programs? Or is there a benefit to congregating together? And these things began to be debated, not just by the people themselves, but also by speakers. So there was an interesting conversation going on there.
I think that's a very important question that had to be debated and had to be talked about, because members of our community on a global stage are very social people.
Yes.
We are people that need social systems. We need to talk to people. We have to sit down with others and be able to converse. And when we were sent into a place where we had to stay at home, where we had to quarantine, a lot of people were missing that.
Yes.
And they didn't have those opportunities. And for a minute, people were taking it for granted. They got a very big reality check on that anything can happen and we have to be able to adapt. Answering that question from the debate, whether what should happen if we should stay with doing it because it was efficient, or whether we should move into a hybrid style program. We were already doing hybrid style programs from before. It's just that now people were being put into a scenario where one option wasn't there for them to do at all.
Sure,
they had to stay at home.
Yeah.
For someone like you living in London, the coronavirus had hit European nations at a very, very drastic scale. What was your personal experiences being a speaker and also a member of your community on how you had to adapt and how you had to move forward with how programs were changed?
Well, there was two things. On a deeply personal level, not much changed. If anything, it was easier for me to give a talk from home than perhaps to travel abroad. So I could be in London and still give talks to the places where I had committed my lectures. So in that sense, it was easier. I could be with family. However, as a community worker, there were some cracks that began to appear early on. One of the things that happened in the month of Ramadan in London was that we decided to deliver iftar packs to anybody who signed up. And we were taken aback by the response and how many people wanted iftar delivered to their home. But alhamdulillah, the youth, ladies, boys and girls, they signed up and we had loads of cars on the road delivering. One of the things that came out of that is the reports coming back from these guys that there are a lot of people living on their own. They would go and there would be people living in pretty difficult situations. And we didn't know about that. So that was an information that was coming to us. And what became increasingly clear was that certain segments of the community were suffering, much more than others were. So for instance, in a given week, in my community, the seniors come to the mosque at least 4 times. So there is a Wednesday senior program, there's Jumeirah program, there's Friday Jummah, and then there is something else happening during the course of the week. So if all that went out of the window. And you've got to remember that many of these people were not the kind who could stay home and somehow find other things to do. The mosque was a lifeline for them. It was the highlight of the day. Half the day would go there, and they were happy with that. All that was finished now. Not only that, those who would like to be around them to help them could not come into their presence to protect them more than to protect themselves. And everybody was meeting from behind doors. Eid time, you went to your grandparents, you had to stay outside 2 meters and say Eid Mubarak. It was taking its toll on these seniors, number one. So there was a lot of depression came in, there was a lot of loneliness, and quite frankly, we lost a lot of people. And I feel we lost them because they somehow gave up as this thing began to just go from days to months and months, and yet there was no solution on the horizon. We were talking about one shot after another shot and then a booster. So that was one problem that came up, and we had to deal with it. So we started a group of us to phone regularly and have half-hour conversations with the seniors and make sure that there was somebody talking to them all the time, make sure that they've got all the groceries they need, deliver stuff. A lot of our boys were delivering to their neighbors who were elderly as well, because nobody could come out. So these are the intangibles that came to light straight away. Personally, there was a sense of resignation, although a few people did try to run programs. The moment there was a little bit of a window that things got a bit better, people tried to run programs, heavily masked. Muharram, that first year also was run with people 3 meters apart and all this. It wasn't the same, yeah? And there was a desperate desire to have that. So it was clear to me that this isolation model, especially for a faith-based community, and I talked to some Christians as well, it wasn't going to work long term. The mosque was not just a place of devotion or the temple or the church. It was a place for social gathering, and it had its role in that, which was much more than the devotional hour. There was a lot more around it, and we needed to restore that as soon as was viable.
You mentioned something about the mental health and the loneliness and the depression that quarantining had brought on to many people while they were going through it. How do you feel that also could have affected the youth of the community? young kids who can't go to mosque to play with their friends, or kids on the older stage, teenagers within those ages who look forward to things like sports
Yeah.
and all that being shut down. How do you feel like that could have affected the youth of the community?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our particular community in Stanmore, a lot of the youth who end up playing sports, like outdoor sports, the contacts and the opportunities arise from madrasa and mosque, and through the clubs that we have within the center, like Stanmore Jaffer in our case. Now, if there isn't that kind of input, then what happens is people turn to indoor sports or indoor games or doing things online and stuff like that, and they lose that social touch. A lot of the youth travel in sports. They come here to Orlando, they come to New York, they go to Dubai, and our international teams gather together. The youth get to know one another, and there is this outdoor activity. All that became either virtually impossible or severely curtailed. I know some guys tried to play football, but whenever the government gave the smallest little latitude, people would try, and it showed the desperation to continue that. The gyms, for example, were shut. The moment the gyms were open for even a little while, people would flock to them. People tried to have indoor gyms. People were trying to find solutions in the circumstances, but they were never quite the same. They were never quite. It was always a compromise.
I definitely agree, and I definitely think it's something will definitely have an effect on the youth and especially the seniors as well. But the solution to the problem, I also feel, is something that's very subjective.
Okay.
When it comes back to our point of the online programs compared to coming to the center as well. I feel like it's something that will have to be based on a community's decision and how they feel
Sure.
moving the programs should be. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's for everybody to ask themselves a very candid question. This is a candid, what's the name? Candid hour?
Candid
Yeah?
hour.
Ask themselves a question, frank question, because it is a fundamental and an important question. We have now seen life under COVID in terms of our devotional activities, and we have got long history of pre-COVID as well. Ask yourself that you potentially were more efficient at home. You could listen to more content, and you could do it more selectively. So it's not like sometimes you come to the mosque and unfortunately the person is speaking about something that is not of your interest, so you can't switch him off or forward him. You're stuck there. But you could do all that at home. Ask yourself this question, and everybody has to do that. Did I become more spiritually, if you like, elevated through that experience? The fact that I was listening to maybe 2 hours of content as opposed to 45 minutes. The fact that I was listening to content that I chose compared to. If you did, then you are in the minority. I really feel that, having talked to several people. Being in a community, the reason why the Sharia is so keen to push communal activity, you look at all our Sharia rules, when people do things together, like they pray together, they eat together, they live in communities together, there's so much thawab. Whereas, when they do stuff that breaks communal ties, like ghiba and the like, there's so much punishment reserved. The reason is that people need each other also to get closer to God, because it's like you feed off each other. Sometimes you'll come to the mosque, you're tired, it's been a long day. Maybe maqtal is going on, you're not really feeling it. Then you turn around and there's a person crying his eyes out. And immediately that softens your heart too. And you feel, no, this is Husseini ibn Ali, right? And your tears come to your eyes. Or, there is somebody who's reciting dua in such a manner that really makes you feel, no, mashallah, this is dua of Imam Sajjad, and you feel that. You wouldn't perhaps be able to replicate that at home so easily, right? So there are very few people who can find individual inspiration when they're on their own. Usually you feed off one another. You help them, they help you. That, I suspect, if you're very, very honest with yourself, you will find that, no, I don't think I became particularly spiritually aware more in COVID. in that circumstance, number one. Number two, if you say, no, that was a fantastic experience, I would reply by saying it's not an either-or situation. You still got that. You still have the ability to channel hop when you go home. Right?
Correct.
It's not that that has been shut off. What had been shut off on this side was mosque. Number three, if you look at hadith, and there are many hadiths about this, but for example, hadith of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, where he highlights the advantages of worshipping communally in a mosque versus doing it at home. Now, by mosque, we can extrapolate that to Islamic center, meaning with the people. And he gives a whole lot of advantages to it. The first he says is that when you go, you get to know about the situation of the people. If there are people who are well, who are unwell, what is the news of the people? You can't do that sitting at home so easily. Number two, you gain inspiration from one another, as I mentioned. And God is pleased when people worship together. Number three, you get the news of where they have been and what they have seen, and there is this sharing of ideas, which sitting at home, you miss out on. Number four, you get the chance to be a helping shoulder for someone who's going through a difficulty. They're really down, things are not going so well for them. The only way you would know is if you met them in the mosque, and you could take them to the side and be a source of comfort for them. All that is there in a setting in the mosque, in the setting in the Imam Bar, in the setting in this. And thankfully, at least in the England experience, once we formally opened this year, the response was overwhelming. People actually had missed it. Because there was a segment of society who were worried that people had got used to staying at home, and will they come back to the mosque? It had been a year and a half. Yeah. People get used to things in a year and a half. But alhamdulillah, the moment it was open, it was like they had never been away. And people were so glad. They hadn't met each other for a long time. Unfortunately, people had not seen each other so long, and some had passed away too. Yeah. There was lots of these, COVID was a tough disease. People sometimes, the last time they saw a loved one was as they were taken from home in an ambulance. They did not see them afterwards. Even when they died, they came back in body bags. You couldn't say Khuda Hafiz. So it was a difficult time, a difficult illness. So people wanted out from that. Yeah. So I think if we're going to say that we learned things in COVID, I would say we learned what doesn't work. This is my opinion personally. Okay. We learned what we don't want. And that is to sit in our individual consoles looking at programs, one mile apart from one another. And the only way I know that you're on there, because I can see your profile on Zoom, and I know you're there. But hey, you know what? I can't hold your hand. I can't hug you on either day, nothing.
It's a different experience being in person and face to face with
someone. This is what I feel that COVID showed very clearly to people, that we had taken stuff for granted. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that past opportunity, and pray to Him to have that opportunity at our fingertips again.
It was definitely a reality check for everybody that had to go through it. And I definitely do agree with you that it showed us more of what we don't want to happen again, and why I think we should be ready for it to happen again, and ready for people to have to adjust and change and adapt to online or to coming back to the center. But it definitely set a stepping stone for communities to look forward
for me personally, there was a hadith, or there is a clear hadith that says, don't take 5 things for granted before you lose them. Amongst them was time and youth, wealth, health, and so on. That's a great hadith, but by the time you figure out, or you're on the receiving end of it, you're really old. You've lost your money, or you've lost your age, youth, or you've lost your health. That time, okay, fine, I should have figured this out ages ago. With COVID, it came, it slapped us in the face and woke us up and said, don't take things for granted. And we still have come out the other side relatively healthy, relatively young, and able to apply that and say, Ya Allah, you know what? There was a time when I wanted to go for ziyarat. I didn't think much more than just try to get vacation time and put some money together. And there was no other question in my mind. Suddenly, for 2 years, I couldn't go for ziyarat. I wanted to go visit family. It was just a case of phoning them and saying, I'm coming around, and I went there. All these things we took for granted. It's like we've had a chance to look at it in a much more grateful way, without having to wait a lifetime to learn that lesson.
Sheikh, our forefathers had a very specific template when it came to migrating to different parts of the world. When we moved to a specific country or specific city, the template went as follows. We would build a center, an Imam Barga, then move on towards a qabristan and also a madrasa. This template was one that we had continued for a very long time, but when we were hit with quarantine and with coronavirus, this template was brought into question. And we were shown a new possible template for the way things could be. Do you feel like this new template could be one that could be more efficient for our community, and even in another sense, one that could be more cost-effective for us?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, this is a question that has been debated, I think, in many cities, because, well, if we can do away with a center or expanding a center or building a new center, we save millions. And we're all about efficiency in our workplace, in our study, in our learning. If we can, in the same amount of time, do 2 hours of learning versus 2 hours or 1.5 hour travel and 30 minutes of learning, surely there are efficiency gains to be made. These arguments merit discussion, but I'll tell you one thing, they ignore an aspect, and that is a more subtle thing that we have in our Sharia. It is very clear for us that when we gather together, there is an additional blessing that is absent when we are on our own. When mu'mineen gather together and remember Allah, and especially remember Ahlul-bayt alayhimus salam, we have in our hadith that angels flood to that place. That Lady Fatima salamullahi alayha spiritually is present. These things cannot be ignored, because that is what adds blessing to a half hour of learning that would be absent in 2 hours of listening, in my opinion, out of that setting. That is very important to remember, that this is what our religion has taught us. And sometimes in our search for efficiency, we don't take these things into account.
Wanted to thank you for taking the time again and speaking here with us about our granular question. And I also wanted to take the time and thank the viewers for listening and watching our very first episode. And inshallah, hopefully, we'll see you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Quarantine has highlighted the social impact it had on our communities. As we move forward, the question that will always be on the back of our mind is, to what extent do we continue airing our programs online? This has been Mikhail Dharsi, and you are watching Candid Hour at HIC. Wassalam.